The auction house reeked of desperation and blood, its stone walls echoing with the cruel laughter of vampire nobility, as they bid on human flesh like livestock. Duchess Seraphina Blackthorne stood at the back of the crowd, her emerald eyes scanning the stage with growing disgust. This was exactly why she avoided such gatherings: the casual cruelty, the reduction of sentient beings to mere commodities, the way her fellow vampires reveled in their superiority over mortal kind. But tonight was different. Tonight, she had a purpose. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the packed hall. Male, approximately 30 years of age, claimed to have some education, but he gestured dismissively at the figure being dragged onto the stage. As you can see, he's hardly prime stock. Seraphina's breath caught as she saw the man they'd brought forward. He was tall but painfully thin, his dark hair matted and unkempt, his clothes little more than rags. But it wasn't his obvious malnourishment that made her step closer. It was something in his bearing, a dignity that remained unbroken despite his circumstances. He's been difficult, the auctioneer continued, consulting his notes. Refuses to speak, won't respond to commands. Previous owner claims he's useless for any practical work. We're starting the bidding at 50 silver pieces. Silence greeted this announcement. 50 silver was already more than most would pay for a problematic slave, and the man on stage looked like he might collapse at any moment. Seraphina watched as potential buyers shook their heads and turned away, their interest moving to the younger, stronger specimens waiting in the wings. 40 silver? The auctioneer tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. Still nothing. 30? The man on stage raised his head slightly, and for just a moment his eyes met Seraphina's across the crowded room. They were the most extraordinary shade of silver blue she'd ever seen, and despite his obvious weakness, they burned with an intelligence that took her breath away. There was something else there too, a flicker of recognition that was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. 20 silver pieces, the auctioneer called out, his voice now openly frustrated. Surely someone can find a use for him, even if it's just kitchen work. 100 gold sovereigns. The words left Seraphina's lips before she'd consciously decided to speak. The entire auction house fell silent, hundreds of vampire heads turning to stare at her in shock. 100 gold sovereigns was more than most slaves sold for in a year, let alone a single useless specimen. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," the auctioneer stammered. "You heard me correctly. 100 gold sovereigns for the man." Seraphina moved through the crowd, her black silk gown rustling as nobles stepped aside to let her pass. "Do I have any competing bids?" The silence stretched on, broken only by whispered conversations and the sound of her heels clicking against the stone floor. No one was foolish enough to bid against a duchess, especially not for a slave they had already dismissed as worthless. "Sold to Her Grace, Duchess Blackthorne," the auctioneer announced, relief evident in his voice. As Seraphina approached the stage to claim her purchase, she caught another glimpse of those extraordinary eyes. This time, she was certain she saw recognition there, and something that might have been gratitude. "What's your name?" she asked softly, as the auction house staff prepared to transfer ownership. The man looked at her for a long moment, his brow furrowed as if the question caused him physical pain. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough from disuse but carried an accent she couldn't quite place. I don't remember." The carriage ride to Seraphina's estate was conducted in silence. The man, she decided to call him Adrian until he remembered his real name, sitting across from her with his hands folded in his lap. He'd accepted the simple clothes and cloak she'd provided without comment, though she noticed how carefully he moved, as if every motion caused him pain. "Are you injured?" she asked, as they turned onto the tree-lined drive that led to Ravenshollow Manor. Adrian looked up, those silver blue eyes focusing on her with surprising intensity. Yes, no, I'm not sure." He pressed a hand to his temple, wincing. "Everything is unclear. When did you last eat a proper meal?" "I don't remember." "Sleep in a real bed?" "I don't remember." Seraphina felt her heart clench with sympathy. Whatever had happened to this man, it had clearly been traumatic enough to affect his memory. The other vampires at the auction had seen only a broken slave, but she saw something else. Someone who needed help, regardless of his species or station. "Well," she said gently as the carriage pulled up to the manor's front steps, "we'll start with food and rest. Everything else can wait." Raven's Hollow Manor was a sprawling estate built in the Gothic style, all soaring towers and arched windows that caught the moonlight like jewels. Adrian stared up at it with an expression she couldn't read, his head tilted as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "Does it seem familiar?" Serafina asked, noticing his reaction. "No, yes, He shook his head, frustrated. "I'm sorry, Your Grace. My thoughts are scattered. Please call me Serafina. And don't apologize for something that isn't your fault." She gestured toward the entrance where her butler was waiting with obvious curiosity. "Come, let's get you settled." The next few weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Serafina had given Adrian a suite of rooms in the manor's east wing, far from the servants' quarters but not quite in the family section either. She told her staff he was a guest recovering from an illness, and while they clearly had questions about her sudden acquisition of a mysterious human, they were too well trained to voice them. Adrian proved to be an enigma. Despite his apparent amnesia, he displayed knowledge and skills that suggested a far more refined background than his circumstances implied. He could read and write in multiple languages, including some that Serafina recognized as ancient vampire dialects. He knew etiquette and protocol that would have taken years to learn. Most puzzling of all, he seemed to instinctively understand the complex social dynamics of vampire society, despite claiming to remember nothing of his past. "You're healing well," Serafina observed one evening as they shared dinner in the manor's smaller dining room. It had become their custom to eat together, partly because Adrian still seemed uncomfortable around the servants, and partly because she found his company surprisingly engaging. "Thanks to your kindness," Adrian replied, and she noticed how much stronger his voice had become. Proper food and rest had worked wonders. His cheeks had filled out, his hair had regained its luster, and there was a vitality about him that had been completely absent at the auction. "I still don't understand why you helped me. Does there need to be a reason? In my experience, vampires don't act without motivation." The words slipped out before he seemed to realize what he'd said, and he looked up sharply, confusion clouding his features. "Your experience?" Serafina set down her wine glass, studying his face. "Adrian, what do you remember about vampires?" He pressed his fingers to his temples, that familiar expression of pain crossing his features. "I know things, but I don't know how I know them. It's like trying to grasp smoke. Perhaps we shouldn't push so hard. Your memories may return naturally, given time. And if they don't, what if I never remember who I was?" The vulnerability in his voice made her chest tighten. Over the past weeks, she'd grown genuinely fond of this mysterious man who read poetry in ancient languages and could discuss philosophy with the depth of a scholar. The thought of him remaining lost, cut off from his own identity, was almost unbearable. "Then you'll become who you choose to be," she said firmly. "The past doesn't have to define us, Adrian. Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what we need." He looked at her with such intensity that she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Is that what you did? Started fresh? What makes you ask that? You're not like other vampires that I seem to know about. You're kind, compassionate. You bought a useless slave for a fortune and asked for nothing in return. That's not typical behavior for your kind." "My kind," she repeated with a bitter laugh. "No, I suppose it isn't. I've always been something of a disappointment to vampire society." "How so?" Serafina hesitated, surprised by her willingness to confide in him. She'd never spoken to anyone about her struggles with vampire culture, her disgust at their casual cruelty, her longing for something more meaningful than the endless pursuit of power and pleasure. "I don't enjoy causing suffering," she said finally. "I don't find pleasure in dominating those weaker than myself. I believe in using power to protect rather than exploit." She met his eyes. "These are not popular opinions among my peers. They sound like the opinions of a good ruler." "A ruler?" She laughed. "I'm hardly that. I'm just a duchess with too much conscience and not enough sense." "A duchess is a ruler," Adrian said quietly, "and conscience is the most important quality any ruler can possess." There was something in his tone, a certainty that spoke of deep conviction. For a moment she could almost see him in different circumstances, not as a broken slave, but as someone accustomed to authority, to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "You speak as if you know something about ruling," she observed. "Do I?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "I suppose I must, though I can't imagine how." Before Serafina could respond, a commotion erupted in the main hall. Raised voices, the sound of heavy footsteps, her butler's protests being overridden by someone with obvious authority. She rose from her chair, every instinct screaming danger. "Stay here," she told Adrian, but he was already standing, his body tense with alertness. "Your Grace," he said, and something in his voice made her turn back. "Be careful." The main hall was filled with vampires in the black and silver livery of the High Council, their faces grim with purpose. At their head stood Lord Commander Valerius, a vampire so ancient and powerful that even other nobles stepped carefully around him. Serafina felt her blood turn cold. The High Council only sent their Lord Commander for matters of the utmost importance. "Your Grace," Valerius said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "We apologize for the intrusion, but we have urgent business to discuss." "Of course, Lord Commander. How may I assist the Council?" "We're searching for someone. A very dangerous individual who escaped custody several weeks ago." Valerius's pale eyes swept the hall, taking in every detail. "We have reason to believe he may have sought refuge in this region." "What sort of individual?" "A traitor to the vampire nation. Someone who would stop at nothing to reclaim power that was rightfully stripped from him." Valerius pulled out a scroll, unrolling it to reveal a detailed portrait. "Have you seen this man?" Serafina's heart stopped. The face in the portrait was unmistakably Adrian's, though drawn with harder lines, more regal bearing, and eyes that burned with authority rather than confusion. The resemblance was so perfect that she had to fight to keep her expression neutral. "No, I haven't seen him," she managed. "Who is he?" "Lucien Dracul, the former vampire king. He was overthrown 6 months ago for crimes against our people and sentenced to exile. However, he escaped before the sentence could be carried out." Valerius rolled up the portrait, his expression grim. "He's extremely dangerous, Your Grace. If you encounter him, you must contact the Council immediately." "Of course. But surely if he's been missing for weeks, he's long gone from this area." "Perhaps. But we have reports of unusual activity in the region. Servants speaking of mysterious guests. Large purchases of supplies." His eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. "Tell me, Your Grace, have you acquired any new residents recently?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Serafina could feel the weight of a dozen vampire gazes upon her, could sense their readiness to tear apart her manor if they suspected she was harboring their fugitive. "I attended a slave auction several weeks ago," she said carefully. "I purchased a human who seemed to need help." "A human?" Valerius's eyebrows rose. "How charitable of you. We'd like to see this human if you don't mind." "I'm afraid that's impossible. He's quite ill, some sort of fever. My physician has quarantined him to prevent contagion." "Surely a brief viewing." "Lord Commander," Serafina interrupted, drawing on every ounce of her noble authority. "Are you suggesting that I would lie to the High Council? That I would harbor a traitor in my own home?" The accusation hung between them, dangerous and electric. To openly question a duchess's word was a serious breach of protocol, but Valerius clearly suspected something. "Of course not, Your Grace," he said finally. "However, given the severity of the situation, I'm sure you understand our need to be thorough." "Naturally. Perhaps when my guest has recovered, you could return for a proper introduction?" "Perhaps." Valerius signaled to his men, and they began filing toward the door. "Your Grace, I trust you understand the importance of reporting any unusual occurrences. The former king is not to be underestimated." "What exactly did he do?" Serafina asked, genuine curiosity overriding her caution. "To warrant such a severe punishment?" Valerius paused at the threshold, his expression darkening. He forgot his place. He began to believe that vampires should show mercy to humans, that our superiority didn't give us the right to do as we pleased with lesser species. Such thinking is not only treasonous, it's dangerous to the very foundation of our society. As the council forces departed, Serafina remained in the hall, her mind reeling. The man she'd been caring for, the gentle soul who read poetry and discussed philosophy, was apparently a deposed king who'd been overthrown for showing compassion to humans. The irony was almost overwhelming. She found Lucien, in the library, standing before the tall windows that overlooked the manor's gardens. He turned as she entered, and she saw immediately that something had changed. His posture was straighter, his bearing more regal, and those silver blue eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there before. "You know," he said quietly, "the High Council was just here. They're looking for someone." She moved closer, studying his face. "Someone named Lucien Dracul, the former vampire king," he said, and his voice carried a weight of authority that made her shiver. "Yes, I remember now. Not everything, but enough." "How much is enough?" "I remember being betrayed by those I trusted most. I remember the spell they used to strip away my powers, to cloud my mind and make me forget who I was." His hands clenched into fists. "I remember being cast out like a common criminal for the crime of believing that power should be used to protect rather than exploit. The same philosophy you criticized them for lacking." "Yes." He turned to face her fully, and she saw pain in his expression. Not the physical pain of his amnesia, but the deeper ache of betrayal and loss. "I remember enough to know that you've been harboring the most wanted vampire in the kingdom. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Serafina stared at him, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. She could turn him into the council, claim the reward that was undoubtedly offered for his capture. She could demand explanations, rage at him for deceiving her. She could order him to leave immediately, to take his dangerous presence away from her home and her people. Instead, she did something that surprised them both. She laughed. "You know what's funny?" she said, sinking into one of the library's leather chairs. "I spent weeks wondering why you seemed so familiar with vampire politics, why you carried yourself like nobility despite your circumstances. I thought you might be some lord's bastard son, or perhaps a scholar who'd fallen on hard times. And instead you discovered you'd been harboring a deposed king. Instead, I discovered that my instincts were correct. You are someone who understands the burden of leadership, someone who struggled with the same questions about power and responsibility that have plagued me my entire life." Lucien stared at her, clearly not having expected this reaction. "Serafina, you don't understand. If the council discovers you've been hiding me, they'll what? Strip me of my title? Exile me?" She shrugged. "Perhaps that wouldn't be such a terrible fate. I've never been particularly good at being a vampire noble anyway. This isn't a joke. They'll kill you. Then we'd better make sure they don't find out." She met his eyes steadily. "Unless, of course, you want to leave. I won't hold you here against your will." "You're offering to continue harboring a fugitive, even knowing who I am?" "I'm offering to continue helping someone I care about. Your title doesn't change that." Lucien was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Why? Because the man I've come to know over these past weeks, kind, thoughtful, struggling to do what's right despite impossible circumstances, that man is worth protecting. Whether he's a king or a slave doesn't matter to me. It should matter. I'm dangerous to you now. You were always dangerous to me," Serafina said softly. "Just not in the way you think." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Over the past weeks, she'd felt herself growing closer to Adrian, drawn to his intelligence and gentleness, his quiet strength and unexpected wisdom. Learning his true identity didn't change those feelings. If anything, it explained why she'd felt such a deep connection to him. "Serafina," he began, but she held up a hand. "You don't have to say anything. I know this complicates everything, but I want you to know that my offer stands. You have a home here for as long as you want it. And if my memories continue to return, if I become more like the king I was and less like the man you've come to know, then I suppose we'll deal with that when it happens." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "For now, you should probably avoid the main areas of the manor. The council may return, and it would be better if you weren't easily found." "Serafina, wait." His voice stopped her at the library door. "Thank you. For everything. I know I can never repay." "You don't owe me anything," she said firmly. "We help each other because that's what people who care about each other do." As she left the library, Serafina felt the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. She was now actively concealing a fugitive from the High Council, risking everything she'd built for a man whose past was still largely a mystery. But as she thought about those silver blue eyes, about the gentle way he'd discussed philosophy and poetry, about the pain in his voice when he'd spoken of betrayal and loss, she knew she'd made the right choice. Some things were worth the risk. The next few days passed in tense normalcy. Lucien, she still thought of him as Adrian most of the time, kept to the manor's more secluded areas, while Serafina maintained her usual routines to avoid suspicion. But she could feel the change in the air, the way her servants whispered among themselves, the increased patrols of council forces in the surrounding countryside. It was only a matter of time before someone discovered the truth. Your Grace? Her butler, Edmund, appeared in the doorway of her study with obvious reluctance. There's a messenger here from Lord Blackwood. He requests an immediate audience. Seraphina's blood chilled. Lord Blackwood was one of the most powerful members of the High Council, and his sudden interest in her affairs could only mean trouble. Send him in, she said, quickly hiding the books on ancient vampire law she'd been studying. Lord Blackwood entered with the predatory grace that marked all ancient vampires, his pale eyes taking in every detail of her study. He was handsome in the cold, perfect way of their kind, but there was something reptilian about his smile. Your Grace, he said, offering a bow that was precisely correct but somehow mocking. How lovely to see you again. Lord Blackwood, to what do I owe the pleasure? I'm afraid it's not entirely a pleasure visit. The Council has some concerns about recent events in your territory. What sort of concerns? Reports of unusual activity, servants speaking of mysterious guests, large expenditures on supplies, increased security around your manor. His smile widened. One might almost think you were hiding something. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Don't you? Come now, Seraphina. We've known each other for decades. I can tell when you're being evasive. The use of her first name was a calculated insult, a reminder that he considered himself her superior despite their equal ranks. Seraphina felt her temper flare, but she kept her expression neutral. I'm not being evasive, my lord. I simply don't understand what you're implying. I'm implying that you may have information relevant to our search for the former king. Information that you're choosing not to share. And why would I do such a thing? Because, Blackwood moved closer, his presence filling the room with menace. You've always been soft-hearted when it comes to lost causes. It would be just like you to take in a wounded bird, regardless of how dangerous it might be. You're speaking in riddles, my lord. Am I? Then you won't mind if I conduct a thorough search of your manor, just to put the Council's concerns to rest, you understand? The threat was clear, and Seraphina knew she was trapped. Refusing would only confirm his suspicions, but allowing the search would mean certain discovery. She needed time to think, to find a way out of this impossible situation. Of course, she said smoothly, though I should warn you that I have a guest recovering from a contagious illness. My physician has recommended strict quarantine. How convenient. And where exactly is this quarantined guest? The East Wing. But as I said, the risk of contagion is a risk I'm willing to take. Blackwood's smile was sharp as a blade. Shall we proceed? As they made their way through the manor's corridors, Seraphina's mind raced through possibilities. She could try to warn Lucian, but Blackwood would notice any delay. She could claim he'd already left, but that would only prompt a wider search. She could, Your Grace. The voice came from behind them, cultured and calm. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Seraphina turned to see Lucian approaching from the main staircase, and her heart nearly stopped. He was dressed in the fine clothes she'd provided, his hair neatly styled, his bearing every inch the nobleman. But more than that, there was something different about him, an aura of power that seemed to fill the corridor despite his supposedly weakened state. Adrian, she said, hoping her voice didn't betray her panic. You shouldn't be up. The physician said, I'm feeling much better, thank you. His silver blue eyes fixed on Blackwood with unmistakable recognition. And you are? Lord Blackwood of the High Council, Blackwood replied, his gaze sharp with suspicion. And you are the mysterious guest we've heard so much about. Guilty as charged, though I hardly think I'm mysterious. Just a man recovering from an unfortunate illness. Indeed. And what sort of illness would that be? The kind that comes from asking too many questions in the wrong places, Lucian said with a slight smile. I'm sure you understand. The two vampires stared at each other across the corridor, and Seraphina could feel the tension crackling between them like lightning. There was something in their exchange, a subtext she couldn't quite grasp, as if they were having an entirely different conversation beneath the polite words. I'm sure I don't, Blackwood said finally. Perhaps you could be more specific? Perhaps I could, but I find that specificity can be dangerous, don't you? Sometimes it's better to speak in generalities to avoid complications. Complications? The kind that arise when one discovers that the world is not quite what it seems. When loyalties are tested, when old certainties crumble. Lucian's voice carried a weight of authority that made even Blackwood step back slightly. I'm sure a man in your position understands the delicate nature of such situations. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, and Serafina could see him trying to place something about Lucian that nagged at his memory. Have we met before? I don't believe so. Though I suppose all nobles begin to look alike after a while? Yes, Blackwood said slowly. I suppose they do. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with Blackwood asking probing questions and Lucian deflecting them with the skill of someone accustomed to political maneuvering. Finally, the council lord seemed to accept that he would learn nothing more. Well, he said, his tone carefully neutral, I'm glad to see you're recovering. Perhaps when you're feeling stronger you might visit the council chambers. We're always interested in meeting new residents of our territory. Perhaps I will, Lucian replied, when I'm feeling more myself. After Blackwood departed, Serafina and Lucian stood in the corridor, neither speaking until they were certain he was gone. That was incredibly risky, Serafina said finally. He could have recognized you. He did recognize me, or at least part of him did. Lucian's expression was grim, but he couldn't quite place where he'd seen me before. The spell that altered my appearance is still partially in effect. How long before it wears off completely? I don't know. Days, weeks, maybe longer. But Serafina, we need to talk. There are things about my past, about why I was overthrown, that you need to understand. They made their way to the library, where Lucian settled into one of the chairs with obvious weariness. The confrontation with Blackwood had clearly taken more out of him than he'd let on. Tell me, Serafina said, taking the chair across from him. The council claims I was overthrown for showing mercy to humans, and that's partially true. But the real reason was more complex. Lucian stared into the fireplace, his expression distant. I discovered something about the council's plans, something that would have changed the balance of power in our world forever. What kind of plans? They're planning to reveal themselves to humanity, not as myths or legends, but as the superior species they believe themselves to be. They want to establish open rule over humans, to end the pretense of hiding in shadows. Serafina felt her blood turn cold. That would mean war. Exactly. A war that would devastate both species, but which the council believes they can win through sheer supernatural superiority. Lucian's hands clenched into fists. I tried to stop them, to convince them that coexistence was possible, that we could find a way to live alongside humans without dominating them. And they saw that as treason. They saw it as weakness. In their minds, showing mercy to humans is tantamount to betraying our own kind. He looked up at her, his silver blue eyes burning with conviction. But I've seen what happens when power is used without restraint, when strength becomes an excuse for cruelty. That's not the kind of world I want to rule. Is that why you helped me at the auction? Even without your memories, you recognized someone who needed protection? Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understands that true strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Serafina spoke. What happens now? The council will keep searching, keep sending investigators. Eventually, someone will recognize you. I know. And when that happens, I'll have to leave. I won't put you in any more danger than I already have. What if you didn't have to leave? Lucian looked up sharply. What do you mean? What if there was a way to fight back, to challenge the council's authority and prevent this war they're planning? Serafina, they have armies, resources, the support of most vampire nobility. I'm one man with no powers and no allies. You have me. The simple statement hung between them, heavy with implication. Lucian stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. You would risk everything? Your title, your lands, your life? For the right cause? Yes. She leaned forward, her green eyes blazing with determination. You said yourself that true strength comes from protecting others. Well, this is my chance to prove that I believe it too. The odds against us would be astronomical. The best causes usually are. Lucian was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him weighing possibilities, calculating risks and benefits with the mind of a strategist. There might be a way, he said finally. Other nobles who were uncomfortable with the council's direction, who might be willing to support a different path if they had strong enough leadership. You mean if they had their rightful king? I mean if they had someone they could believe in, Someone who represented hope for a better future rather than a return to the past. And you think you could be that someone? I think we could be that someone. Together. He reached across the space between their chairs, taking her hand in his. But I need you to understand what you'd be agreeing to. This wouldn't just be harboring a fugitive, this would be open rebellion against the established order. I understand. Do you? Because once we start down this path, there's no going back. The Council will see us as enemies, and they'll stop at nothing to destroy us. Then we'd better make sure we succeed. Lucian's smile was the first truly joyful expression she'd seen from him since his memories had begun returning. You're remarkable, do you know that? I'm terrified, she admitted, but I'm also more certain of this than I've ever been of anything in my life. In that case, Lucian said, bringing her hand to his lips, let's start a revolution. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of secret meetings and careful planning. Using Serafina's connections and Lucian's knowledge of vampire politics, they began reaching out to potential allies, nobles who had grown uncomfortable with the Council's increasingly aggressive policies, younger vampires who questioned the old ways, even some humans who had learned of the supernatural world and feared what open conflict might bring. The response was more encouraging than either of them had dared hope. It seemed that the Council's authoritarian rule had created more dissatisfaction than they'd realized, and many vampires were eager for an alternative, especially one led by their rightful king. Lord Ashford has agreed to meet with us, Serafina reported after returning from a clandestine journey to the Northern Territories. He controls 3 major cities and their surrounding lands. If we can convince him to join us, we'd have a real chance, Lucian finished. Ashford is respected among the old families. His support would legitimize our cause. There's more. Lady Ravencroft has been quietly gathering intelligence on the Council's military preparations. According to her sources, they're planning to make their move within the next 6 months. Sooner than I expected. Lucian's expression darkened. We need to accelerate our timeline. Can we be ready? We'll have to be. As their rebellion took shape, Serafina found herself marveling at the transformation in Lucian. The gentle, confused man she'd rescued from the auction was still there, but he was now balanced by the strategic mind of a king, the natural leader who had once ruled the vampire nation with wisdom and compassion. But it wasn't just his leadership abilities that drew her to him. Over the weeks of working together, planning and plotting and dreaming of a better future, she'd fallen completely and irrevocably in love with him. She thought he might feel the same way. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her heart race, and there were moments when the air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken desire. But neither of them had acknowledged what was growing between them, too focused on the monumental task ahead, to risk the complications that romance might bring. That changed the night before their first major gathering of allies. Are you nervous? Lucian asked as they stood together on the manor's balcony, looking out over the moonlit gardens. Terrified, Serafina admitted. Tomorrow we officially declare ourselves enemies of the High Council. There's no going back after that. We could still call it off. Send word to our allies, tell them we've reconsidered. Is that what you want? No, but I want you to be certain. Once we do this, your life will never be the same. My life changed the moment I bought a useless slave at auction, she said with a smile. Everything since then has just been clarification. Clarification of what really matters, of who I want to be, what I want to fight for. She turned to face him fully. Of who I want to fight alongside. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Lucian stepped closer, his silver blue eyes searching her face. Serafina, I know this complicates things. I know we have more important matters to focus on, but I can't go into tomorrow without telling you how I feel. How do you feel? Like I've been waiting my entire life for you to walk into it. Like everything that came before was just preparation for this moment, this choice, this chance to build something better together. Lucian's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. I love you, he said simply. I've loved you since the moment you looked at me in that auction house and saw something worth saving. I've loved you through every kindness, every moment of understanding, every choice you've made to stand beside me despite the cost. Even though I'm not human, even though loving me means loving someone from the very species you're trying to protect, especially because of that. You prove that vampires can be more than what the Council wants us to be. You show me every day that power and compassion aren't mutually exclusive. When he kissed her, it was with the passion of weeks of suppressed longing, the desperation of two people who had found something precious in the midst of chaos. Serafina melted into his embrace, feeling complete for the first time in her long life. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she whispered against his lips, "I want you to know that this, us, is worth every risk." "Tomorrow we change the world," Lucian said, his forehead resting against hers. "Tonight, let's just be ourselves." The gathering took place in the ruins of an ancient castle deep in the forest, far from prying eyes and council surveillance. Representatives from across the vampire territories had come, drawn by whispered promises of change and the hope of a better future. Serafina stood at Lucian's side as he addressed the assembled nobles, watching as he transformed from the man she loved into the king he had been born to be. His voice carried across the ruins with natural authority, his presence commanding attention and respect. "My fellow vampires," he began, "we stand at a crossroads. We can continue down the path the council has chosen, a path that leads to war, to the destruction of both our species and humanity. Or we can choose a different way." "And what way is that?" called out Lord Ashford, his voice skeptical but not hostile. "The way of coexistence, of using our strength to protect rather than dominate, of proving that vampires can be more than the monsters our enemies claim we are." "Pretty words," said another voice from the crowd, "but the humans will never accept us as equals. They fear us, and fear breeds hatred." "Some will," Lucian acknowledged, "but not all. There are humans who already know of our existence, who work alongside us in secret. There are those who understand that our species share more than we realize, the capacity for love, for sacrifice, for choosing hope over fear." He gestured toward Serafina, and she felt every eye in the assembly turn toward her. "The Duchess Blackthorn has shown me what it means to lead with compassion rather than cruelty. She saved a broken stranger not because she had to, but because it was right. That is the kind of leadership our people need." "You're asking us to risk everything on an ideal," Lady Ravencroft observed. "To bet our lives on the hope that humans and vampires can live in peace." "I'm asking you to risk everything on the certainty that the alternative is worse," Lucian replied. "The Council's war will destroy us all. But if we stand together, if we offer humanity partnership instead of domination, we might build something better than either species could achieve alone." The debate continued for hours, with voices raised in argument and discussion. But gradually, Serafina could see the tide turning. One by one, the assembled nobles pledged their support to Lucian's cause, swayed by his vision of a different future. By dawn, they had the foundation of a real rebellion. "It's not enough," Lucian said as they made their way back to Ravenshollow Manor. "We have perhaps a third of the vampire nobility, and that's not counting the Council's military forces." "It's a start," Serafina replied, "and we have something the Council doesn't. The moral authority of fighting for what's right. Moral authority doesn't stop silver bullets or wooden stakes. No, but it inspires people to fight harder, to sacrifice more, to believe in something beyond themselves." She took his hand, squeezing gently. "We'll find a way, Lucian. We have to." Their optimism was short-lived. 3 days after the gathering, Council forces surrounded Ravenshollow Manor in overwhelming numbers. Serafina watched from her study window as black-armored vampires took positions around the estate, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. "They know," she said, as Lucian joined her at the window. "Yes. The question is how much they know." Their answer came in the form of Lord Commander Valerius himself, who approached the manor under a flag of truce. Serafina and Lucian met him in the main hall, flanked by what few guards they could trust. "Your Grace," Valerius said with mock courtesy, "and your former majesty. How illuminating to finally meet you both in your true capacities." "Lord Commander," Lucian replied, his voice steady despite the obvious danger, "to what do we owe this visit?" "I think you know. We're here to collect a fugitive and his accomplice." "Accomplice?" Serafina stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "I prefer the term ally. Call it what you will. The result is the same. You've both committed treason against the vampire nation." "We've committed the crime of believing in something better," Lucian said, "of refusing to accept that might makes right. How noble, and how futile." Valerius gestured, and his soldiers moved closer. "You're outnumbered 50-1. Surrender now, and your deaths will be quick." "And if we refuse?" Then they'll be considerably less pleasant. Serafina felt Lucian tense beside her, saw his hand move toward the sword at his side. Even without his full powers, he was still a formidable warrior. But against 50 council soldiers, courage would only carry them so far. "Wait," she said, stepping between them. "I have a proposal." "I'm listening," Valerius said, though his expression suggested he wasn't particularly interested. "Single combat. Your champion against ours. Winner takes all." "Serafina, no," Lucian said urgently. "You can't." "I can, and I will." She kept her eyes on Valerius. "Unless, of course, the mighty High Council is afraid of a fair fight." Valerius's eyes narrowed at the challenge. "You would stake everything on a single duel?" "I would stake everything on the belief that right will triumph over might." "And who would serve as your champion?" "The powerless former king." "Me," Serafina said simply. The declaration sent shockwaves through both groups. Lucian grabbed her arm, his face pale with horror. "Absolutely not. I won't let you. You won't let me?" She turned to face him, her green eyes blazing. "I'm not yours to command, Lucian. This is my choice. It's suicide. Maybe. But it's also the only chance we have." She looked back at Valerius. "Do you accept? This is highly irregular, but not unprecedented. The old laws still recognize trial by combat, don't they?" Valerius was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. Single combat it is. My champion against yours, to be held at dawn in the manor's courtyard. The winner's faction claims victory." As the council forces withdrew to prepare, Lucian rounded on Serafina with fury and desperation warring in his expression. "What were you thinking? You can't possibly hope to defeat whoever they choose as their champion." "Can't I? I've been training with weapons for over a century, Lucian. I'm not helpless. You're not a warrior either. And they'll choose someone specifically designed to kill you. Then I'll have to be better than they expect. This is madness. This is hope." She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Do you trust me?" "With my life." "But Serafina, then trust me with this. Trust that I know what I'm doing. And if you're wrong, if you lose, then at least I'll have died fighting for something I believe in, alongside the man I love." The hours until dawn passed in a blur of preparation and desperate planning. Serafina selected her weapons, a sword and dagger combination that played to her speed and agility rather than raw strength. She reviewed everything she knew about council fighting techniques, trying to anticipate what kind of opponent they might choose. But mostly, she tried not to think about the very real possibility that she was about to die. "There's still time to call this off," Lucian said as they stood together in the pre-dawn darkness. "We could try to fight our way out, or we could trust in the power of doing what's right." Serafina checked her weapons one final time, then turned to face him. "Whatever happens out there, I want you to know that these past months have been the happiest of my life. Don't talk like that. You're going to win. I'm going to try. But if I don't..." She kissed him softly. "Promise me you'll keep fighting. Promise me you won't let them destroy the dream we've built together." "I promise. But only if you promise to come back to me. I promise to do everything in my power to make that happen." Dawn broke gray and cold over Ravenshollow Manor as the two factions assembled in the courtyard. The council forces formed a perfect square around the makeshift arena, while Serafina's few allies clustered together in nervous solidarity. Valerius stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "By the ancient laws of our people, this dispute will be settled by trial of combat. Single champions, fighting to the death or surrender. The victor's cause shall be deemed just." "And your champion?" Serafina asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Lord Blackwood has volunteered for the honor." Serafina's heart sank as the vampire lord stepped into the arena. Blackwood was not only ancient and powerful, but he was known throughout vampire society as one of the finest swordsmen of his generation. Against him, her century of training seemed woefully inadequate. "Any last words?" Blackwood asked as they faced each other across the courtyard. "Just one," Serafina replied, drawing her sword. "Justice." The fight began with explosive violence as Blackwood launched himself forward with supernatural speed. Serafina barely managed to parry his opening strike, the force of it sending shockwaves up her arm. He was stronger than her, faster than her, more experienced than her, everything she'd feared. But she had something he didn't. desperation born of love and conviction. She fought with everything she had, using every trick she'd ever learned, every advantage her smaller size and greater agility could provide. She couldn't match his strength, so she focused on precision. She couldn't match his speed, so she anticipated his moves. She couldn't match his experience, so she fought with the unpredictability of someone who had nothing left to lose. For long minutes, they danced around each other in a deadly ballet of steel and shadow. Blackwood's blade whistled through the air where she'd been moments before, while her own strikes found gaps in his defense that shouldn't have existed. But gradually, inevitably, his superior abilities began to tell. A cut across her shoulder, another along her ribs. Her breathing became labored while his remained steady. Her movements grew slower, while his maintained their lethal precision. "Yield," he said as his blade found her throat, drawing a thin line of blood. "You've fought well, but this is over." Serafina looked past him to where Lucian stood, his face a mask of anguish and pride. She thought of everything they'd built together, everything they'd hoped to achieve. She thought of the future they'd dreamed of, where vampires and humans could coexist in peace. And she made her choice. Instead of yielding, she grabbed Blackwood's blade with her bare hand, ignoring the pain as it cut deep into her palm. The unexpected move caught him off guard, and in that moment of surprise she drove her dagger up under his ribs, finding the gap in his armor with desperate precision. Blackwood's eyes widened in shock as he looked down at the blade protruding from his chest. "Impossible. Not impossible," Serafina gasped, blood flowing freely from her wounded hand. "Just unexpected." Blackwood collapsed to his knees, then fell forward onto the courtyard stones. The arena fell silent except for the sound of Serafina's labored breathing and the whisper of wind through the trees. "The victory goes to Duchess Blackthorn," Valerius announced, his voice carefully neutral. "By the ancient laws, her cause is deemed just." As the council forces began their withdrawal, Lucian rushed to Serafina's side, catching her as her legs gave out. "You did it," he whispered, cradling her against his chest. "You actually did it." "We did it," she corrected, then smiled despite her pain. "Though I think I'll leave the dramatic dueling to you from now on." "Agreed. I never want to go through that again." As the sun rose higher over Raven's Hollow Manor, painting the courtyard in shades of gold and hope, Serafina allowed herself to believe that they might actually succeed. The council had been forced to acknowledge their legitimacy. Their allies would be emboldened by the victory, and most importantly, they had proven that love and conviction could triumph over force and fear. It was only the beginning, she knew. There would be more battles ahead, more challenges to face, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time since this all began, she truly believed they could build the better world they'd dreamed of. "So," she said as Lucian helped her to her feet, "what's next for the Vampire King and his Duchess?" "Next we change everything," Lucian replied, his silver blue eyes bright with possibility. "Together." "Together," she agreed and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of blood and victory and the bright promise of tomorrow. What an absolutely incredible journey from slave auction to revolution. I'm still breathless from that final duel. The way Serafina fought not just for her life but for everything she and Lucian had built together was absolutely heart-stopping. The transformation of both characters throughout this story was masterful. Lucian evolving from a broken, memory-lost slave back into a king who chose love over power, and Serafina discovering that true nobility comes from fighting for what's right, not from titles or bloodlines. What did you think of the twist that the useless slave was actually a deposed king? Did you see it coming? Or were you as surprised as Serafina? And that moment when she chose to protect him even after learning his true identity, that's when you know it's real love. If you loved this epic tale of hidden identities, forbidden love, and the courage to challenge an entire system, please hit that subscribe button. I have so many more incredible stories waiting for you. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Serafina and Lucian can actually succeed in creating peace between vampires and humans? Or are they fighting an impossible battle? And here's something that's been haunting me. Was Lucian's memory loss a blessing in disguise that allowed him to fall in love without the burden of his crown? Next week, I'm bringing you another breathtaking supernatural romance. Witch hunter falls in love with his target. She's been protecting his village for 200 years. Trust me, you won't want to miss that emotional roller coaster.